On the cold autumn night of November 12, 1996, Clara Hayes, a dedicated 28-year-old nurse, clocked out from her shift at the bustling St. Jude's Medical Center. She walked out of her ward and into thin air. One moment she was there, a familiar, comforting presence in the sterile hallways. The next, she had vanished from the face of the earth. For 28 years, her family was left shattered, haunted by questions with no answers. The police investigation hit a wall of silence, her case, file buried under decades of other tragedies, turning ice cold. It was as if the hospital itself had swallowed her whole. That is, until this year. 2 first-year medical students at a local university were tasked with cleaning an old teaching skeleton, recently donated from the now-renovated St. Jude's. As they handled the fragile bones, they heard a faint metallic rattle from deep within its chest. Curious, they shook the rib cage gently, and something small and dark fell out, clattering, onto the steel table. It was a single tarnished locker key. But this key wouldn't just open a dusty, forgotten locker. It would unlock a 28-year-old secret, revealing a truth far more terrifying than her family had ever imagined, and exposing the monster who had been hiding in plain sight all along. The story of what happened to Clara Hayes doesn't begin with a key, but in the sterile, quiet hum of a hospital late at night. November 12, 1996. Inside Baltimore's St. Jude's Medical Center, the overnight shift moved at its own unique rhythm, a world of hushed footsteps on polished linoleum, of beeping machines keeping a steady electronic vigil over the sick and sleeping. This was Clara's world. At 28, she navigated it with a quiet competence that made her a favorite among patients and a pillar of reliability for her colleagues. She moved through the dimly lit ward, her presence a small comfort in the darkness. She'd stop to adjust an elderly patient's blanket, her hands gentle, her voice a low murmur that could soothe the most anxious soul. She was meticulous, double-checking charts and medication times, with a focus that bordered on obsessive. To her, these weren't just tasks. They were sacred duties. Each patient was someone's parent, someone's sibling, someone's love. It was a philosophy she carried in every step. Just after 3 a.m., during her final break, she sat in the stark, empty break room, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee. She dialed a number she knew by heart. Miles away, her younger sister Lena, 19 years old and drowning in textbooks, answered on the second ring. St. Jude's night watch calling. Clara's voice was warm, a stark contrast to the sterile room around her. Is Professor Thompson being cruel? Lena let out a tired laugh. He's a sadist, Clara. I'm pretty sure my brain is going to leak out of my ears. This cellular biology midterm is a monster. Just a few more hours, Len, Clara said, and Lena could picture the reassuring smile on her face. My shift is done at 7. I'll pick you up, we'll get that greasy pizza from Sal's, and you can forget all about cellular biology for a night. Deal? Deal, Lena said, the word a life raft in her sea of academic stress. Just be safe. That place is creepy at night. Always am, Clara replied. See you in a few? That was the last conversation they ever had, a simple promise of pizza and comfort. A small, ordinary moment of sisterly connection that would soon become a haunting echo in a nightmare that was just beginning. At 7:05 a.m., Clara Hayes officially clocked out. A fellow nurse saw her wave a quick goodbye before heading down the long corridor toward the staff lockers and the east exit. The automatic doors would have slid open, letting in the crisp November air. And then, nothing. Lena sat in her beat-up Honda Civic in the sprawling, impersonal parking lot of St. Jude's. The sun was rising, painting the sky in pale shades of gray and pink, but the hospital, a monolithic block of brick and glass, seemed to swallow the light. She had the radio on low, a rock song she usually loved, now just irritating noise. 7:15. Annoyance began to prick at her patience. 7:30. Annoyance curdled into a knot of unease in her stomach. Clara was never late. Not like this. Her punctuality was a running joke in their family. Lena killed the engine, the sudden silence making the vastness of the parking lot feel more menacing. She scanned the doors, watching other nurses and doctors walk out, their faces weary from the long night, their bodies moving with the singular purpose of reaching their cars and going home. None of them were Clara. 7:45. The unease was now a cold, sharp-edged fear. She replayed their phone call. Clara had sounded tired but normal, happy even. The thought was a desperate plea. Lena finally got out of the car, her legs feeling stiff and unsteady. She walked toward the imposing east entrance, the automatic doors sliding open with a soft whoosh, releasing a gust of warm, antiseptic-scented air. The lobby was mostly empty, a cavernous space that echoed with the sound of her own frantic heartbeat. The security guard at the main desk barely looked up from his newspaper. "Excuse me?" Lena's voice was higher than she intended. "I'm looking for a nurse, Clara Hayes. Her shift ended 45 minutes ago." The guard sighed, the sound of a man profoundly bored. "Lady, her shift ended. That means she left. Thousands of people work here. I can't keep track of all of them." His dismissal felt like a physical blow, but Lena pushed back. "She was supposed to pick me up. She would have called. Something's wrong." He gave her a look that was a mixture of pity and irritation before gesturing to a payphone on the wall. "Call her floor, then." Her hands trembled as she punched in the numbers she'd memorized for emergencies. A nurse with a tired, flat voice answered. "Third floor, night shift. I'm trying to find my sister, Clara." "Hayes?" Lena said, trying to keep her voice steady. Her shift ended at 7. There was a pause, a rustle of papers. "Hayes. Yeah, she clocked out. I saw her myself. She was heading for the lockers." The nurse's tone was matter-of-fact, detached. For her, this was a minor inconvenience at the end of a long night. She had no way of knowing she was delivering a verdict. Lena hung up the phone, the receiver slick with sweat in her palm. The world began to tilt. The nurse's words echoed in her mind. She was inside, and she had left her post. But she never made it to the car. Lena stood frozen in the center of the lobby, the morning light now streaming through the large glass windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The distance from the hospital doors to her car was maybe 100 yards. A short, simple walk she had watched dozens of others complete without incident. But for Clara, that short distance had become an impossible, terrifying chasm. It was a gap in reality, a void into which her sister had simply disappeared. In the first 48 hours after a person vanishes, the world of their loved ones shrinks to the size of a single desperate hope. The phone call. Lena Hayes lived by that phone. Every ring sent a jolt of adrenaline through her veins, a wild prayer that it would be Clara's voice on the other end, full of apologies, explaining some bizarre but logical reason for her absence. But that call never came. Instead, she got calls from Detective Miller, a weary, overworked man from the Baltimore Police Department. He spoke in the dispassionate, methodical language of procedure. To him, Clara's case was a file, a series of boxes to be ticked. To Lena, it was the shattering of her universe. "Ms. Hayes," he'd ask, his voice tired over the line, "are you sure your sister didn't have a secret boyfriend? A new circle of friends? Was she in any kind of trouble? Debt? Sometimes people just need to get away." Each question felt like a small betrayal, an insinuation that Clara was somehow responsible for her own disappearance. Lena would patiently answer, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and rage. She gave them everything, Clara's dental records, her last bank statement, a list of every friend she'd ever had. She felt like she was screaming into a void, her panic meeting a wall of professional calm. The hospital, St. Jude's Medical Center, became a fortress of non-information. Citing patient privacy and corporate policy, the administration offered condolences, but little else. Lena's requests to view security tapes were met with vague statements about camera malfunctions and blind spots. Her pleas to speak with more of Clara's colleagues were gently but firmly denied. It became sickeningly clear that the hospital was more concerned with protecting its reputation from scandal than with finding one of its own. Detective Miller did, however, secure a formal interview with the esteemed Dr. Alistair Finch. the senior surgeon on duty the night Clara disappeared. In a conference room that smelled of leather and polish, Finch was the very picture of concerned authority. He leaned forward, his hands clasped, his expression a mask of solemnity. "Clara was one of our brightest, Detective," Finch said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "A truly compassionate soul. We are all just devastated." He paused, choosing his words with a surgeon's precision. "Of course, nursing is an incredibly high-stress profession. The things these young women see, it takes a toll. Many of them lead complicated private lives to cope." He delivered the line with a sigh of feigned reluctance, a masterful performance of a man sharing a sad but unavoidable truth. In that single calculated statement, he subtly shifted the narrative. Clara wasn't a victim of a crime that happened within his hospital's walls. She was a troubled woman whose personal life had likely caught up with her. Detective Miller, like so many others, was charmed by Finch's charisma and authority. He jotted down a note, his suspicion moving further and further away from the hospital. The investigation officially pivoted, focusing for weeks on an ex-boyfriend with a solid alibi. Precious time was lost. The leads dried up. Within 6 months, the case of Clara Hayes was no longer active. It became another name in a thick, dusty binder of unsolved cases, a quiet monument to a life interrupted. The weeks turned into months, the months into years. The world moved on, but Lena remained frozen in the cold morning of November 12, 1996. For a time, she tried to solve the mystery herself. Her small apartment, once a tidy student sanctuary, became a chaotic command center of grief. Maps of Baltimore were pinned to the walls, with red string connecting the hospital to bus stations, airports, and parks. She created homemade flyers with Clara's smiling face and plastered them on every telephone pole and community board she could find. She called Clara's old colleagues relentlessly. Her desperate questions eventually met with pity, then irritation, then the cold silence of unanswered calls. Her obsession took its toll. Her college grades plummeted. Her friends, once a source of comfort, began to drift away. They wanted to help, but they couldn't comprehend the unique torture of not knowing. They'd offer platitudes, encouraging her to find closure or to move on, words that felt like daggers. How could she move on? From a ghost? How could she find closure for a story with no ending? Through it all, she clung to one detail, a single anchor in a sea of uncertainty. She remembered Clara's complaint just a week before she vanished about a doctor who thinks he's God. She must have repeated this to Detective Miller a dozen times. Each time, he gave her the same weary response. "Ms. Hayes, it's a major hospital. Half the surgeons have a God complex. It's hospital gossip, not a lead." His dismissal of the one clue that felt viscerally important to Lena carved a deep channel of frustration in her heart. It was the feeling of knowing something vital, but having no one listen. Time is a relentless force. It doesn't heal all wounds, but it forces the living to keep living. Lena graduated from college a year late. At the ceremony, there was an empty chair between her and her parents, a silent, gaping hole where Clara's proud, cheering presence should have been. The day, meant to be a celebration of a future beginning, was just another reminder of the future that had been stolen. Eventually, Lena found a fragile, painful peace. She became a high school history teacher, finding a strange solace in the clear narratives of the past, with their defined beginnings and endings. She packed the maps and flyers into a box and slid it under her bed. She learned to function, to smile, to build a life. But the uncertainty remained, a low-grade fever that never broke. She took the long way to work just to avoid driving past St. Jude's. She would change the channel if a news report about a missing person came on. It wasn't healing. It was the careful, painstaking construction of scar tissue over a wound that refused to close. For 28 years, she lived in this quiet desert of uncertainty, never knowing that the answer to her life's great, agonizing question wasn't buried in some unmarked grave, but was silently waiting, hidden inside a hollow bone. For 28 years, the story of Clara Hayes was a story of silence, But that silence was about to be broken, not by a confession or a long-lost witness, but by two students who had no idea they were about to reach back in time and grasp a thread of a long-forgotten mystery. The year is 2024. The anatomy lab at the University of Maryland is a modern, sterile space, a world away from the aging corridors of St. Jude's. Here, two first-year medical students, Samira and Ben, were tasked with a decidedly unglamorous job: cleaning and cataloging old teaching specimens. They were both top of their class, fueled by coffee and a friendly rivalry, preparing for their first major anatomy exams. Their final task of the day was an old, yellowed skeleton, affectionately nicknamed Mr. Bones by generations of students. He was a relic from a bygone era, donated by St. Jude's Hospital decades ago when they upgraded to newer plastic models. "Can you believe they used to learn on this guy?" Ben said, tapping a finger against the skeleton's brittle-looking femur. "He looks like he's 100 years old." "Show some respect," Samira countered with a wry smile. "He's taught more doctors than we'll ever meet." She carefully lifted the rib cage to clean the thoracic cavity, a routine she'd done a dozen times. But this time was different. From deep within the chest, they heard it. A faint but distinct metallic rattle. It wasn't the click of bone against bone. It was something else, something foreign. They froze, exchanging a look of pure curiosity. "What was that?" Ben whispered. Samira gently shook the rib cage again. The rattle was clearer this time. With the careful precision of a future surgeon, Ben tilted the entire torso. A small, dark object, dislodged from its hiding place, tumbled through the latticework of ribs and clattered onto the stainless steel examination tray. It wasn't a bone fragment. It was a key. Small, brass-colored, and greened with age. A small number was stamped into the metal, C47. They stared at it, their academic minds racing. It was impossible. A key couldn't have naturally ended up inside a human skeleton. This wasn't anatomy. It was a riddle. How did it get there? Who would hide a key inside a rib cage, and why? Their first instinct was a logical one. Ben, the more tech-savvy of the two, immediately went to the university's archives on his laptop. He confirmed the skeleton's origin, donated by St. Jude's Medical Center in 2002 during a major renovation. Samira took a different path. A knot of unease was forming in her stomach. She opened a web browser and typed in a simple search query: St. Jude's Hospital Missing Person, 1990s. The results were a mix of irrelevant news, but then one link stood out. It was a cold case blog, the kind run by amateur sleuths. The headline sent a chill down her spine. They read the article together, the words painting a picture of a young nurse who had disappeared from that very hospital in 1996. The article mentioned she had vanished after her shift, last seen near the staff lockers. Staff lockers! Samira looked at the key on the tray, the number C47 seeming to glow under the lab's fluorescent lights. Ben looked at the screen, then back at the key. The playful curiosity was gone, replaced by a chilling realization. This wasn't a prank or a strange coincidence. This was evidence. In a quiet high school classroom across town, Clara Hayes was in her element. At 47, she was a respected history teacher, known for making the past come alive for her students. "And so, you see," she was saying, pacing in front of her class, "history can change in an instant. A single letter, a forgotten diary, one small object discovered by accident can completely reframe everything we thought we knew." As if on cue, the classroom door opened. The school secretary stood there, a look of apology on her face. "Ms. Hayes, I'm so sorry to interrupt. There's a phone call for you. A Detective Rossi. She said it's important." Lena felt a flicker of annoyance, but she excused herself and walked into the empty hallway, the sounds of her students muffled behind the closed door. She took the phone. "This is Clara Hayes." The voice on the other end was professional, calm, and female. "Ms. Hayes, my name is Detective Isabella Rossi with the Baltimore Police Cold Case Unit. I'm calling you regarding your sister, Clara Hayes." Lena's breath caught in her throat. Decades of forced composure, of carefully constructed emotional walls, began to tremble. "We've received some information," Detective Rossi continued, her voice steady. "An object was found that we believe may be connected to your sister's disappearance." Lena leaned against the cold brick of the hallway, gripping the phone. "What object?" she managed to whisper. Detective Rossi paused for a fraction of a second. "A key, Ms. Hayes. It was found by students at the University of Maryland. It was found inside a medical skeleton that was donated by St. Jude's Hospital years ago." Inside a medical skeleton. The words didn't make sense. The world dissolved into a roaring in her ears, the school hallway seeming to stretch and distort. For 28 years, she had lived in a desert of 1,000 agonizing possibilities. Clara had run away. Clara had been abducted. Clara was living a new life somewhere, having forgotten her. But not this, never this. The sheer macabre strangeness of it was more horrifying than anything she had ever imagined. The two emotions she had suppressed for nearly 3 decades slammed into her at once, a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated terror, and a single, tiny, sharp-edged shard of hope. The discovery of that key in such an unlikely place left investigators with more questions than answers. It's incredible how a single item can rewrite history. If you, like me, are fascinated by these mysteries, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss a single twist. Hope, for someone like Lena Hayes, was a dangerous country she had long ago forbidden herself from visiting. But now she was being dragged back across its border by a woman she had just met. Detective Isabella Rossi was nothing like the weary, dismissive cop who had handled Clara's case in 1996. In her late 30s, Rossi was sharp, energetic, and possessed an empathetic intensity that made you feel like your case was the only one in the world that mattered. She belonged to a new generation of law enforcement, one that understood that cold cases weren't just forgotten files, but unhealed wounds. They met in a small, neutral coffee shop, the smell of roasted coffee beans a strange backdrop for a conversation about a 28-year-old nightmare. Lena was visibly trembling, a civilian thrown back into the storm. Rossi was a calm anchor, her voice steady as she laid out the next steps. "First, we need to confirm the key is from St. Jude's," Rossi explained, her gaze direct and unwavering. "If it is, we need to find out if that locker still exists. It's a long shot after all this time, Lena, but it's the only shot we have." Lena stared into her untouched cup of coffee. A part of her, the scarred and cynical part, wanted to scream that it was pointless, just another way to have her heart broken. She found herself telling Rossi about Detective Miller, about his condescending questions, about her desperate attempts to make him listen. "I told him," Lena said, her voice a low murmur. "I told him about the Dr. Clara complained about. The one she said acted like he was God. Miller he just looked at me like I was a hysterical child." Rossi leaned forward slightly, her pen pausing over her notebook. "And you're sure she was talking about Dr. Finch?" "She didn't use his name," Lena admitted. "But he was the king of that hospital. Everyone knew it." Unlike Miller, Rossi didn't dismiss it. She simply wrote the name Dr. Finch in her notebook and underlined it twice. For the first time in 28 years, Lena felt heard. It was a small thing, but it felt monumental. Getting access to St. Jude's required a warrant. The hospital, now a sleek, modern marvel of glass and steel, bore little resemblance to the institution Lena remembered. The new lobby was bright and airy, a deliberate architectural choice to inspire confidence and calm. But for Lena, walking through its doors felt like entering a mausoleum. Rossi led her past the bustling new wings, guided by a reluctant hospital administrator to a part of the building that time had forgotten. The old staff wing, now used for storage, was a journey into the past. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. Flickering fluorescent lights cast long, dancing shadows over furniture draped in white sheets like rows of silent ghosts. And then they saw them. Tucked away in a dark alcove, a bank of old staff lockers, their gray paint chipped and peeling, their doors tattooed with rust. Lena's heart hammered against her ribs. She watched as Rossi ran her flashlight beam over the faded numbers, C45, C46. There it was, C47. The locker door was shut tight, sealed by decades of grime and humidity. It looked as if it hadn't been opened since the day Clara disappeared. This was it, the moment of truth. Rossi pulled on a pair of latex gloves and carefully inserted the old, tarnished key into the lock. It resisted, the metal groaning in protest. For a terrifying second, Lena was sure it wouldn't work. Rossi applied firm, steady pressure. With a loud grating, the lock, seized by nearly 3 decades of disuse, finally gave way. The sound echoed in the dead, silent hallway. Rossi pulled the door, and it creaked open on rusted hinges, revealing the darkness within, and inside there was nothing, just dust. A thick, gray blanket of it coating the bottom of the locker, the faint musty smell of stale air and time itself. The hope that had flickered to life inside Lena just moments before was extinguished, violently and completely. A choked sob escaped her lips. A voice in her head whispered. The key was a prank, a fluke, a meaningless piece of metal. But while Lena saw an ending, Detective Rossi saw a crime scene. She ignored the emptiness and focused on the details. She ran a gloved finger along the interior walls, her touch light, and practiced. She tapped the metal surfaces, listening. The sides gave a hollow ping, but the back panel, it was different. The sound was a dull, flat thud. She aimed her flashlight at it. "Look here," she said, her voice sharp with focus. She pointed to the 4 screws holding the thin back panel in place. The metal around them was rusted, but the screw heads themselves were relatively clean. They were newer than the rest of the locker. Using a multi-tool from her investigation kit, Rossi carefully worked on the first screw. It resisted, then turned. One by one, she removed them, the scraping sound loud in the tense silence. She lifted the panel away. Lena held her breath. Taped to the cold, dark metal of the locker's outer shell was a small, neatly folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, but perfectly preserved in its dark, dry tomb. Rossi didn't touch it directly. She used a pair of tweezers to gently peel it from the wall and place it into a clear evidence bag. She held it up for Lena to see. It was a carbon copy of a pharmacist's dispensing note, the kind used for internal records. The text was faded but legible. It detailed a prescription for a dosage of lorazepam so high it would have been lethal for most adults. The patient's name was listed as John Doe. The date was November 12, 1996. And at the bottom, an authorizing signature, written in a confident, elegant script that bordered on arrogant. The world stopped. In that single moment, every one of Lena's agonizing theories, every sleepless night spent wondering if her sister had simply chosen to leave her, was obliterated. Clara hadn't run away. She hadn't abandoned her. She was a victim. This piece of paper was the proof. And the name, Dr. Finch, the doctor who thinks he's God. The clue she had carried like a burning coal in her heart for 28 years, the one that everyone had told her was meaningless, was real. It wasn't just gossip. It was the key to everything. Lena looked up from the evidence bag and met Detective Rossi's eyes. The grief and confusion that had clouded her face for decades was gone, replaced by a new cold fire. The long, passive, agonizing wait was over. The hunt had just begun. With the pharmacist's note, Detective Rossi had a weapon, but a 28-year-old weapon was only as good as the person who could still testify to its origins. Her investigation now had a singular focus, finding the man who filled that prescription. His name, according to Old St. Jude's employment records, was Arthur Coleman. Rossi found him living in a quiet, manicured suburb, a man in his late 70s who spent his days gardening. He was frail, with hands that trembled slightly, but when Rossi showed him a copy of the dispensing note, his eyes, cloudy with age, became sharp with a fear that was anything but frail. At first, he denied everything. Sitting in his own pristine living room, with the smell of roses drifting in from the garden, he lied. I don't remember this," he stammered, his eyes refusing to meet Rossi's. "It was so long ago. We filled hundreds of prescriptions a day." He shifted in his armchair. Dr. Finch was a brilliant surgeon, a pillar of this community. I would have had no reason to question his authority. Rossi knew he was lying. She could see it in the way he gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. Arthur Coleman was scared. He had broken protocol decades ago, and the ghost of that decision had just walked through his front door. But without his cooperation, the note was just a piece of paper. Rossi left, knowing she would be back. While one door closed, another one opened, leading the investigation down a dark and winding path. Following standard procedure, Rossi's team began re-interviewing every employee who worked at St. Jude's in November of 1996. Most had little to add, but one former nurse, a woman named Beverly, seemed almost eager to talk. She'd always harbored a bitter jealousy towards Clara, whose competence had often overshadowed her own. "You know," Beverly said, a hint of malicious gossip in her tone, "Clara wasn't the saint everyone thought she was." She went on to spin a detailed, credible-sounding story about seeing Clara in a series of heated arguments with a young married resident named Dr. Marcus Thorne. She painted a picture of a secret, volatile affair, suggesting Clara was threatening to expose him, giving him a powerful motive for wanting her silenced. The lead was too specific to ignore. The investigation pivoted, spending precious days and resources tracking down Dr. Thorne, who was now a successful pediatrician in another state. When detectives showed up at his office, he was utterly bewildered. He admitted that he and Clara had been friends and that they had once had a minor professional disagreement over a patient's treatment plan. But an affair? The idea was absurd. His alibi for the night of the disappearance, he was at his own daughter's school play with 100 witnesses, was quickly and easily confirmed. The lead was a dead end, a deliberate act of sabotage by a bitter colleague and a stark reminder of how personal grudges could poison the search for truth. Rossi kept Lena informed of every development, including the dead end with Dr. Thorne. The news was confusing to Lena. The story didn't sound like the sister she knew. Clara was private, but she wasn't reckless, Lena insisted over the phone. "Sometimes the people we love have secrets," Rossi said gently. "But I need you to think, Lena. Go back to that time. Is there anything, any name, any small detail you might have overlooked?" That night, driven by a new sense of purpose, Lena pulled a dusty box from the top of her closet. It was filled with Clara's things, a time capsule of a life cut short. She found old letters, photographs, and at the very bottom, a small, cheap daily planner from 1996. She had looked through it a dozen times over the years, but now she looked with new eyes. The pages were mostly filled with the mundane notes of a busy life. But as she flipped to the first week of November, just 7 days before Clara vanished, her finger stopped on one entry. The handwriting was rushed, angry. It said, Lena's heart stopped. "Mr. Gable." She remembered the name. He was an elderly patient Clara had been particularly fond of. She had been saddened by his death, which had been sudden. But she had never connected him to her sister's complaint about the God-complex doctor. Until now. She grabbed her phone, her hands shaking. The name was the key Rossi had been missing. She pulled the file for a patient named Robert Gable, a 78-year-old man admitted for a routine hip replacement. He was one of Dr. Finch's patients. His official cause of death, signed by Finch himself, was listed as acute cardiac arrest. It was clean, unquestionable. But when Rossi laid his chart next to the timeline of Clara's disappearance, the pieces began to fit. Mr. Gable had died just 2 days before Clara vanished. Rossi now had leverage. She drove back to Arthur Coleman's house, this time with a new, sharper edge to her questions. She sat opposite him in the same armchair. "We're past the point of, I don't remember, Arthur," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Let's talk about Robert Gable." At the mention of the name, the color drained from the old pharmacist's face. "We know Dr. Finch ordered an off-the-books dose of lorazepam right around the time Mr. Gable died and right before Clara Hayes disappeared," Rossi pressed on. "We know you filled it. We know you kept it. Quiet. This is your one chance, Arthur. Your one chance to be a witness instead of a co-conspirator." The word hung in the air between them. Arthur Coleman began to tremble, not from age, but from a terror that had been buried for 28 years. He stood up and paced his living room, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was a man caught between the ghost of his fear of Dr. Finch and his new fear of the law. Finally, he collapsed back into his chair, a broken man. The dam of his silence burst. "He was intimidating," Arthur whispered, the words tumbling out. "Dr. Finch. He said the prescription was for a VIP patient, someone who needed absolute privacy. He said if I valued my job, I would do as I was told, and keep my mouth shut." Rossi leaned in. "And did you see him with Clara Hayes that night? The night she disappeared?" Arthur nodded, tears welling in his eyes. "Yes," he said, his voice cracking. "About an hour before her shift ended. They were near the pharmacy, arguing. They were whispering, but the tone, it was furious." "What did you hear, Arthur?" Rossi asked, her voice soft now. "What did she say?" The old pharmacist looked up, his eyes meeting Rossi's for the first time. He delivered the final devastating piece of the puzzle. "I heard the nurse, Clara," he said. Her voice was shaking, but she was clear. She looked right at him and said, "This is wrong, and I am going to the medical board." This was it, the aha moment, the lightning strike that illuminated the entire dark landscape of the case. It was no longer about a mysterious disappearance. It was about a cover-up. Rossi now had it all. The means, in the form of the unauthorized sedative, the motive, a threat of exposure that would have destroyed Finch's career, and now a witness who placed the victim and the prime suspect in a direct confrontation on the very night of the crime. The case against the untouchable Dr. Alistair Finch was no longer circumstantial. It was terrifyingly real. The puzzle was now complete. With the pharmacist's testimony, Detective Rossi could finally see the full, horrifying picture of what happened on November 12, 1996. The story wasn't just about a murder. It was about a monstrous ego and a god complex that festered behind the sterile mask of a celebrated surgeon. Dr. Alistair Finch didn't see himself as a criminal. In his own mind, he was a pioneer, a visionary on the verge of a medical breakthrough. For years, he had been secretly testing an experimental drug cocktail on his most vulnerable patients, convinced he could reverse the effects of dementia. He saw ethics and regulations as chains meant for lesser minds, obstacles to his genius. His patients were not people. They were data points. Their lives were expendable for what he believed was a greater good, his greater good. Clara Hayes, with her meticulous nature and unwavering sense of right and wrong, was a threat to his entire world. She didn't just suspect something was wrong. She did the work. She noticed the pattern. Patients on Finch's secret regimen would decline suddenly, their records subtly altered, their deaths quietly swept under the rug. The death of Mr. Gable, a man she had cared for deeply, was the last straw. She gathered her notes, her observations, her proof. As Arthur Coleman testified, she confronted him. Her threat to go to the medical board was not just a threat to Finch's career. It was an existential attack on his legacy, his identity, and his self-proclaimed divinity. Finch, a master of manipulation, didn't panic. He feigned concern, telling Clara she was misunderstanding a complex but legitimate research protocol. He played to her sense of duty, asking her to meet him in a secluded, rarely used wing of the hospital after her shift, so he could walk her through the files and clear up the confusion. In that empty, echoing hallway, the pretense vanished. There was no struggle, no messy, violent confrontation. Dr. Finch didn't use a common weapon. He used his own tools of the trade. He had the lethal dose of lorazepam already prepared. He was a doctor. He knew exactly how to administer it to look like a simple, tragic overdose, the kind a stressed-out nurse might inflict upon herself. It was quiet, clinical, and utterly evil. The cover-up that followed was a masterclass in arrogance and abuse of power. As the senior surgeon on call, his authority was absolute. He moved Clara's body to the hospital morgue himself. He created a fake Jane Doe admission file, complete with a fabricated story of a transient found near the hospital who died of natural causes. He signed the death certificate, and because the body was officially unclaimed, he fast-tracked it for cremation by the city. The evidence of his crime, Clara's very existence, was turned to ash, and in a final, sickening act of hubris, he kept a trophy. He took the key from Clara's pocket and walked back to his private office. There, he pushed the small, brass key deep into the chest cavity of the old teaching skeleton that stood in the corner. It was his private joke, a symbol of his victory over the insignificant nurse who had dared to challenge him. It was a secret he thought he would take to his grave. Now, 28 years later, that secret was about to come for him. Dr. Finch's home was a testament to his success, a modern mansion of glass and steel overlooking the city, filled with expensive art and minimalist furniture. It was the home of a man who believed he was untouchable. He greeted Detective Rossi and her team at the door with a confident, almost amused smile, as if they were guests arriving for a dinner party. "Detectives," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Please come in." He led them into a cavernous living room, offering them coffee, playing the role of the pillar of the community, happy to assist the police. The interrogation began politely. Rossi asked him about Clara Hayes. "Oh, a terrible tragedy," Finch said, shaking his head with practiced sadness. "I remember the girl, a fine nurse. It was a great loss to St. Jude's." Rossi placed a copy of the pharmacist's note on his marble coffee table. "You remember this, doctor?" Finch glanced at it, his expression unchanging. "Barely. This is from decades ago, Detective. A simple clerical error, most likely. It happens." Rossi remained calm, her voice even. She laid out the evidence, piece by piece, like a dealer laying. Cards on a table, the key found inside his old office skeleton, the locker it opened, the note hidden inside, the testimony of Arthur Coleman, the connection to the death of Robert Gable. With each new piece of the puzzle, a hairline crack appeared in Finch's perfect facade. His smile tightened. His relaxed posture stiffened. The amused host was gone, replaced by something cold and hard. The final blow came when Rossi leaned forward. "We have your signature on an unauthorized prescription for a lethal dose of sedatives issued on the exact day a nurse who threatened to expose you vanished from your hospital. A nurse whose locker key was found inside a skeleton that spent years in your personal office. It was then that the mask finally shattered. The charm, the intelligence, the respected public face, it all evaporated, revealing the raging, narcissistic monster beneath. "This is absurd," he spat, his voice no longer smooth, but a venomous hiss. "That old fool Coleman is senile. You have nothing. You think you can come into my house and accuse me based on the ramblings of an old man and a piece of paper? I will have your badges. I will sue this entire department into oblivion." His rant was not a denial. It was an explosion of pure, entitled rage from a god whose divinity had been questioned. He hadn't confessed, but he had shown them his true face. Rossi stood up, her expression unreadable. "Dr. Alistair Finch," she said, her voice cutting through his tirade, "you're under arrest for the murder of Clara Hayes." The image was surreal. The great Dr. Finch, the celebrated philanthropist, the medical genius, being placed in handcuffs in his own multi-million-dollar living room, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. The scene cuts to Lena, sitting in the quiet darkness of her home, her phone clutched in her hand. It's Rossi on the other end. Her voice is simple, direct. "We got him, Lena." Lena closes her eyes, and for the first time in 28 years, she allows herself to break. A single tear, then another, falls. A silent final surrender to a grief she had held at bay for more than half her life. The trial of Dr. Alistair Finch was a media sensation. The story of the vanished nurse and the key in the skeleton captivated the city. In the courtroom, the prosecution meticulously laid out the evidence, creating an unbreakable chain that stretched across 28 years. They presented the key, the pharmacist's note, and the damning testimony of Arthur Coleman, whose confession on the stand was both heartbreaking and powerful. Inspired by the case, other families came forward, their own long-held suspicions about Dr. Finch's miracle cures finally seeing the light of day. They told stories of loved ones who had died suddenly under his care. The defense attorneys tried to portray their client as a brilliant, misunderstood physician and Arthur Coleman as a confused old man with a faulty memory. But they could not explain away the key, hidden for decades inside the doctor's personal office skeleton. Through it all, Dr. Finch remained a statue of arrogant defiance. He showed no remorse, no sadness, no flicker of humanity. When the jury foreman read the verdict, guilty of murder in the first degree, the expression on Finch's face was not one of shock or despair. It was one of pure, narcissistic indignation, the look of a god who had just been judged by mortals. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the outside world, it was a moment of triumph, a clear victory of good over evil. But for Lena Hayes, sitting in the front row of the courtroom, the feeling was far more complex. The verdict was not a magic wand that could erase 28 years of pain. It was justice, but it was a justice scarred by an unbearable truth. When it was her turn to give a victim impact statement, she did not speak to the judge, nor did she grant Dr. Finch a single glance. She spoke to the memory of her sister. She talked about the stolen future, the missed birthdays, the graduations and holidays that were always haunted by an empty chair. She spoke of Clara's kindness, her dedication, and her quiet strength. In that courtroom, Lena was not just a victim's sister. She was a historian, reclaiming her sister's story from the cold, hard text of case files and newspaper headlines, giving her the voice that was so brutally silenced. In the quiet aftermath of the trial, Lena was left with a strange, new emptiness. The consuming quest that had defined her entire adult life was over. The monster was in a cage, but caging the monster could not bring her sister back. The truth, the thing she had chased for so long, was a heavier burden than she had ever imagined. But it was the truth, and it was infinitely better than the long, dark desert of not knowing. The impact of Clara's story rippled far beyond the courtroom walls. The case sparked a statewide debate on patient safety and medical authority. A new piece of legislation, quickly nicknamed the Clara Law, was passed. It mandated stricter multi-signature protocols for dispensing powerful off-record medications in hospitals and created robust new whistleblower protections for medical staff who dared to speak up. Lena, using funds from a successful civil suit against the hospital, created the Clara Hayes Memorial Scholarship for Nursing Ethics. Every year it would be awarded to a nursing student who demonstrated the same integrity and compassion that had defined Clara's life. It was Lena's way of transforming her private pain into a public protection, ensuring her sister's legacy would not be one of tragedy, but one of hope and safety for generations to come. The story of Clara Hayes teaches us that no voice should be silenced forever. It proves that the truth, no matter how deep it is buried or how long it is hidden, has a way of finding its way to the light, a single key, a forgotten note. And the perseverance of those who refuse to let a memory die can be enough to rewrite history and expose a monster. Your subscription isn't just a click, it's an echo that amplifies these stories and strengthens our community. Please help this community get louder and stronger. Subscribe, and let us know in the comments from which city you watched this incredible conclusion.